Maybe if you can't read the equipment labels, Margaret, you should find work that doesn't require literacy. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before 75 Army soldiers arrived demanding her by name. Seattle General's night shift hums with fluorescent buzz and antiseptic sting. The ER moves at its own rhythm, a rhythm Margaret Walsh has learned in 3 years the way a jazz musician learns a standard. Steel grey hair pulled tight in a bun. Hand steady as surgical laser guidance when threading fours. Gait that favors her left leg only when she thinks no one is watching, a legacy of terrain she cannot name and operations that were officially erased from every government database in existence. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in glass. She doesn't flinch at the sound anymore. Room 347 holds Army Sergeant Derek Moss. Motorcycle accident recovery. Lacerated spleen repaired. Fractured left radius in a soft cast. His eyes are the clouded blue of someone whose memory was scrambled by impact and trauma, consciousness returning in pieces that don't quite fit together. The IED blast that took his legs had also taken the architecture of his brain, neural pathways rerouted, some severed completely, others firing in sequence that made no sense to him. He stares at his left forearm constantly. At the name tattooed there in military-issued ink. Walsh. For letters. A name that should mean something to him, feels like it should feel like coming home, but instead feels like waking in a room that belongs to a stranger. Margaret changes his for without making eye contact. Her movements are practiced, economical, the kind of efficiency that comes not from nursing school but from field medicine under fire. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The insertion smooth. The flush of saline without resistance. His vein accepts the plastic catheter like recognition, like muscle memory knows something his brain has forgotten. She secures the line with precision tape, not too tight, not loose, and her eyes move past his face to the monitor. Heart rate steady. O2 sat 96 on room air. Sinus rhythm. The data is clean. The patient is healing. She reaches for the 4 bag and that's when his voice comes soft. Do I know you? Margaret's hand doesn't pause. The bag slides into the drip chamber with practiced certainty. She adjusts the flow rate, 15 drops per minute, and then she answers without looking down. You're healing, Sergeant. That's what matters. That name. On my arm. It means something. She finishes documenting in his chart. Neat handwriting. Exact times. Vital signs at 2,247 hours. She could be a robot. She sounds like she could be a robot. But something in the way she holds his chart, like it's sacred, like it's a promise, suggests this is someone who has learned to hide everything beneath professional distance. Rest now, she says, and she leaves the room before he can ask again. The hallway stretches long under the fluorescent lights. Margaret moves toward the supply closet at the end, where the 4 fluids live, where the cardiac monitors wait in their boxes, where she has spent the last 2 months signing for equipment that doesn't match the invoices and wondering why Dr. Whitfield's eyes light up every time she makes a notation. The supply closet smells like cardboard and plastic and something chemical underneath, like ozone after a defibrillator fires. She breathes it in. Grounding. Real. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Whitfield appears at the vending machine outside the break room with the kind of sudden timing that suggests calculation rather than coincidence. His designer watch, an Omega Seamaster worth $12,000, catches the fluorescent light and throws it across the wall like a beacon announcing his arrival. He is tall in the way wealthy men are tall, shoulders back, spine straight, the kind of posture that says he has never questioned his right to occupy space. His smile reaches his teeth but doesn't reach his eyes. Never the eyes. Ah, Margaret, he says, approaching the vending machine where she stands with a dollar bill folded in her hand. The supply closet inventory. You signed for a shipment of cardiac monitors last Tuesday. She inserts the bill without responding. The machine clicks and whirs. A bag of peanuts tumbles down. The invoice says 42 units, Whitfield continues, his voice moving into that particular register men use when they've decided to perform cruelty. but the receiving log you sign shows only 38. For monitors missing. Or perhaps you simply can't read the numbers clearly. Maybe if you can't read the equipment labels, Margaret, you should find work that doesn't require literacy. Margaret retrieves the peanuts from the slot. The bag crinkles in her fingers. She turns to face him and her expression doesn't change, hasn't changed, will not change. Her jaw is steady. Her eyes are flat, the color of Atlantic water in winter. She looks at him the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved. The discrepancy was noted, she says quietly. The delivery driver confirmed for units were never loaded on the truck. I documented it in the supply log on page 7. Under the date. Did you? Whitfield says. Not a question. He steps closer to the vending machine, forcing her to move aside or make contact. She moves. She always moves. You know, when I reviewed your documentation, I found it difficult to parse. The handwriting. The abbreviations. It occurred to me that perhaps a different role in a hospital might suit you better. Something less dependent on precision. Housekeeping, perhaps. Or dietary. Somewhere your limitations wouldn't impact patient care. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a monitor beeps its steady rhythm. Margaret opens the peanut bag and eats one. Then another. Then she speaks. The cardiac monitor discrepancy is resolved, Dr. Whitfield. The units will be reordered. The documentation stands. He laughs. It's a small sound, controlled, the laugh of someone who practices superiority in mirrors. You have such confidence, he says. For someone so clearly out of their depth in a modern medical environment. Tell me, Margaret, in your time here at Seattle General, have you had any formal training in contemporary protocols? Or are you still operating on institutional knowledge from several decades ago? She doesn't answer. She turns back to the vending machine and feeds another dollar bill into the slot. The deliberateness of the action is a kind of response. A kind of refusal. His presence is like pressure, like the air before a storm, but she has learned to move through pressure the way wind moves through trees, bending but not breaking. What he doesn't know, what he could not possibly comprehend, is that 18 years before she became a night shift nurse at Seattle General, Margaret Walsh held the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer in the Navy. 18 years before the vending machine confrontation, she was a combat medic attached to SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, operating in Ramadi under JSOC Task Force 121 authorization. 18 years before Whitfield decided her career was expendable, she had performed direct cardiac massage through an open chest cavity while incoming fire hammered the mud around her, had carried a man 4 miles through enemy territory with his spleen liquefying inside him and his consciousness flickering like a dying light. The classified extraction operation went wrong in ways that cannot be documented. The reports were buried. The bodies were classified. Naval intelligence erased her service records and issued her a new social security number with explicit orders never to surface. She didn't exist. Existing meant danger for 17 men who were supposed to be dead. Existing meant exposure for operations that had never officially happened. So she disappeared into the civilian world. She became a nurse. She learned to make her hands gentle instead of urgent. She learned to speak softly. She learned to be invisible. But her muscle memory didn't disappear. Her knowledge of human anatomy in extremis didn't fade. Her hand still knew how to find a femoral artery in less than 3 seconds. Her eye still assessed a room in terms of cover, elevation, and exit vectors. She was a ghost in scrubs, haunted by the faces of men she'd saved and by the phantom weight of a world she couldn't talk about. Sergeant Derek Moss was supposed to be one of the dead. The motorcycle accident that brought him to Seattle General, the lacerated spleen, the fractured arm, the concussion that scrambled his memory, all of it was supposed to kill him. And it nearly did. But when she changed his for and he looked at her with eyes that recognized nothing, she saw 17 men looking back at her. She saw Ramadi. She saw sand and blood and her own hands gloved in both. And she saw the name tattooed on his forearm and understood that even amnesia had an erased loyalty. Even a broken brain remembered what her hands had done for him. Whitfield is still talking. Something about documentation standards and professional development. Margaret listens to him the way the ocean listens to rain, acknowledging its arrival, changing nothing. She has been trained by better men to resist worse tactics. She has seen what actual leadership looks like, what actual courage looks like, what happens when someone stands in front of you with nothing left to hide. The supply discrepancy has been addressed, she says, turning from the vending machine with measured calm. Her voice drops slightly lower than necessary. I'll ensure future inventory matches documentation precisely. Is there anything else, Doctor? His jaw tightens. He's waiting for her to break, for her voice to crack, for her eyes to betray something human. Instead, she simply stands there, hands loose at her sides, expression neutral as a military headstone. The trembling he's expecting doesn't come. The tears he's hoping for stay locked somewhere deep. It's as though she's made of something harder than pride, something forged in circumstances he cannot fathom. That will be all, Margaret, he says finally, and he turns away with the irritation of a man who has discovered that money and status and institutional power cannot break what was never constructed from fragile material in the first place. She watches him leave. Then she walks back toward room 347, where Sergeant Derek Moss is staring at the name on his forearm, trying to remember the person who earned it in blood and saving grace. The night shift hums on. The monitors beep their steady rhythm. Somewhere in the hospital, systems are grinding toward a reckoning that no one yet comprehends. The monitors beep their steady rhythm as the morning shifts begin. Seattle General wakes up around 6 a.m., the fluorescent lights humming their characteristic buzz, the smell of industrial-grade antiseptic mixing with fresh coffee from the break room. Margaret moves through the corridors with the precise efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times before, someone who has monitored vitals in sandstorms, who has triaged casualties by starlight, who has learned that every motion matters when seconds are currency and lives are collateral. But this morning, in the clinical brightness of grand rounds, that history is invisible. Dr. Whitfield leads 8 residents through the hospital corridors, their white coats crisp as new money, their shoes squeaking on the polished tile in perfect cadence. He stops at the nurse's station where Margaret is restocking the crash cart, her movements automatic, her focus tight. Whitfield holds up a patient chart, Margaret's chart, the way a prosecutor holds up evidence. Here we have a textbook example of dangerously outdated protocols, he announces, his voice pitched for the residents trailing behind him like goslings. Nurse Walsh apparently believes we're still practicing medicine in the 1990s. Margaret's hand pauses over the defibrillator pads. 1 count. 2. Her jaw clenches once, a single muscular contraction that would be invisible to anyone not looking directly at her, and then goes completely still. She continues counting. 12 pads per pack. 38 pads in inventory. Her fingers move with the meticulous precision of someone performing ritual, not work. The residents shuffle their feet. One of them snickers. It's a quiet sound, but in the morning quiet of the station, it carries weight. Her vital sign documentation is from a template discontinued in 2015, Whitfield continues, turning pages as if he's conducting a clinic lecture. Perhaps Grandma Walsh learned nursing before we had computers? Should we get her some flashcards? He doesn't wait for a response. He doesn't need one. The residents are already looking at Margaret with the particular cruelty of people absorbing permission from authority. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. She logs the final count in the crash cart inventory, a small leather-bound notebook she's maintained for 3 years, every entry in the same meticulous script. One of the younger residents, a woman named Chen, watches this with something approaching discomfort, but Whitfield is already moving, shepherding his entourage toward the ICU, and the moment passes like most moments do in hospitals, briefly attended to, then forgotten by everyone except the person it happened to. By afternoon, the humidity in Philadelphia has started to climb. The ER thermostat fights a losing battle against August heat, and Margaret has been on her feet for 6 hours when she stops at the vending machine on the 3rd floor. She selects coffee, black, the same selection she's made every day for 3 years, and feeds in a dollar bill that emerges wrinkled from her scrub pocket. Dr. Whitfield appears with 2 hospital administrators, his timing too perfect to be coincidence. He must have been watching for her. The thought doesn't trouble her, anticipating threats is muscle memory. "Margaret, do you need help reading those buttons?" His voice carries the particular tone of forced helpfulness, the kind that masks contempt like a surgeon's mask covers a mouth. I know the LED display can be challenging for immature eyes. He reaches past her and presses the cancel button. The dollar drops back into the return slot with a metallic clunk. The administrators shift their weight. One of them, Hartford, the CEO's deputy, has the good grace to look uncomfortable, but he doesn't intervene. The hierarchy is clear. The message is being delivered intentionally, and his presence is part of the delivery. "Maybe stick to the picture buttons," Whitfield says. Margaret retrieves her dollar. She feeds it back into the slot. She makes the exact same selection. Her movements are slow, deliberate, each one a small assertion of agency that costs nothing and changes nothing. As she collects her coffee, she hears Whitfield say to the administrators, "We're documenting everything for legal." It's a threat delivered as office procedure. She walks away without responding. The coffee is bitter and lukewarm by the time she reaches the staff lounge. The supply closet that afternoon is her sanctuary, rows of latex gloves, boxes of syringes, shelves of medications in clinical order. She's reviewing a shipment of cardiac monitors when Whitfield enters, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounds like a lock engaging. The closet suddenly feels smaller. The air pressure changes the way it does before a storm. "These cardiac monitor invoice numbers don't match the delivery count," he says, not bothering with preamble. His voice is quieter now, stripped of its performance quality. This is his real voice, the one he uses when there's no audience. It's somehow worse. "You signed for them." Margaret's pen hovers over the delivery manifest. The boxes stacked behind her contain 18 cardiac monitors. The invoice lists 23. 3 months ago, she noticed the discrepancy. 3 months ago, she made the decision that would define everything that followed. She documented it. Not officially, never officially, because official channels lead to questions about how she can read invoice numbers that precise, how she can catch accounting errors that most nurses miss, how she has the kind of attention to detail that belongs to someone trained in surveillance and intelligence work. "I signed what the delivery driver gave me at 2 a.m., doctor," she says quietly. The truth, but not the whole truth. Never the whole truth. His voice drops further, becomes something intimate and terrible. "The State Nursing Board would be very interested in your attention to detail. One more incident and I'll have security escort you out of this hospital. Are we clear?" The pen trembles. Not much, a millimeter of motion that's barely visible, but it's there. 18 years of discipline cracking just enough to show the pressure underneath. Her knuckles whiten on the ballpoint. "Crystal, doctor." He leaves. She stands motionless in the supply closet for 15 seconds after the door closes, breathing in the smell of sterile packaging and plastic, feeling the fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects. The trembling passes. By the time she emerges, she is composed again, the brief breach sealed. Back at the nurse's station, a younger nurse, Katie, recent graduate from Temple University, is finishing her charting. She watches Margaret return and whispers, "Why do you take that? Why don't you report him?" Margaret doesn't answer. She pulls up her next patient's chart and doesn't look up. Katie persists anyway, driven by the particular righteousness of youth. "He's gaslighting you. It's textbook. My psych professor said." "He's strategizing," Margaret says quietly. "There's a difference." That evening, Margaret arrives home to find her 12-year-old daughter Emma at the kitchen table, her homework spread across the surface like a crime scene investigation. Algebra worksheets. A half-finished essay on the Reconstruction era. Emma looks up with the particular radar children develop for parental distress. "Why are you home early?" Emma asks. "Did something happen?" Margaret moves through the kitchen in the automatic motions of preparation, drawer opens, pot emerges, water fills from the tap. She doesn't answer immediately because the answer requires architecture she's not built in 3 years of civilian life. The architecture would require explaining that Dr. Whitfield has made calls, is making calls, has built a coalition of people who believe things about her that aren't true. It requires explaining that she kept documentation of billing discrepancies that weren't her responsibility to notice. It requires, ultimately, explaining why a combat medic from a classified operation in Ramadi is working nights in a Philadelphia ER, why her service records don't exist, why a man with a tattoo bearing her name on his forearm has no memory of how it got there. Just a long shift, Margaret says instead. She starts the pasta water. The kitchen fills with the sound of the stove's ignition, a small click hiss of gas catching flame. Emma returns to her homework, but Margaret feels her daughter's attention, the particular attention of a child who has learned to read the signs of her parents' distress the way other children read bedtime stories. They've moved 3 times. Margaret has held 7 different jobs. Emma has attended 5 schools. Each transition came with an explanation that was true but incomplete. Mom's job changed. We needed a fresh start. It's time to move to a new city. Never the real reason, someone new. We can't stay. The water boils. Margaret adds pasta. The smell of tomato sauce heating in another pan begins to fill the kitchen, garlic, oregano, a note of copper from the can. She stirs. She waits. She does not think about the cardiac monitor invoices, or about how the numbers were altered with a precision that suggests expertise, or about how Whitfield knows she caught it because Whitfield himself made the alterations and is trying to determine how much she knows. She does not think about any of this because she has learned, over 18 years and multiple wars, how to compartmentalize. How to function while carrying information that could destroy everything. But that night, after Emma is asleep, Margaret sits at the kitchen table for 42 minutes, staring at nothing, her hands folded precisely in front of her. The house is quiet. The only sound is the distant hum of the refrigerator and, somewhere outside, the city's nighttime pulse, sirens in the distance, the rumble of late traffic, the electric hum of the world continuing its rotation while her own world contracts. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric monotone at 3:51 p.m. when the ER doors exploded inward like someone had detonated the hinges from the inside. A man in a black jacket, wild-eyed and trembling, stormed through the threshold screaming so loud the sound arrived before his voice could register as human language. Whitfield! Dr. Whitfield killed my brother! His right hand came up. The knife was 8 inches of stainless steel, the kind you'd find in any kitchen drawer, and it caught the overhead lights like a mirror as he moved toward the physician's area where Whitfield stood reviewing charts, his golf buddy demeanor momentarily replaced by the pale comprehension of a man realizing his comfortable world was about to crumble. Staff scattered like water drops hitting hot oil. A resident backed into a crash cart. A nurse pulled a patient away from the advancing man, her voice thin and useless calling for security. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the knowledge that security was 60 seconds away, maybe 90, and 60 seconds in a trauma bay is 6 lifetimes when someone's holding a blade with the kind of desperate fury that makes calculation irrelevant. The ER dissolved into the specific chaos of panic, a monitor abandoned mid-beep, a footpole clattering on tile, someone's badge hitting the floor like a dropped coin. Margaret was 15 feet away. She was restocking the crash cart, her hands moving through the muscle memory of 3 years and 18 years and 1,000 moments that had never actually happened in her official medical record. She saw Whitfield's face change. She saw the man's knuckles whiten around the knife handle. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who had the luxury of hesitation. Instead, her body moved the way bodies move when they've been trained by the kind of military that doesn't exist in official Pentagon databases. She stepped between the knife and Whitfield. Her hands came up in a disarming stance, fingers spread, elbows tight, weight distributed across her feet in a way that looked casual to anyone who wasn't trained to recognize the posture of someone who'd stood between her own unit and threats that came out of desert darkness at 3 a.m. "Sir, I understand you're in pain," she said, her voice steady as surgical steel. "What's your brother's name?" The man hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 1 second. Then the blade moved forward like it had a mind of its own, like grief had taken over his motor control and left his consciousness screaming from somewhere behind his own eyes. The knife went through her left shoulder. Not into her body like a surgical entry point, through it, like she was nothing but an obstacle in his trajectory toward Whitfield. The sensation registered as pressure first, then heat, then the specific sensation of a blade moving through tissue that didn't belong to her in the way she'd trained to understand anatomy. She didn't scream. Her hands moved instead. They came up and seized his wrist, trapping it, twisting with the kind of practiced precision that came from hours in a gymnasium on a military base that had been officially decommissioned, using techniques borrowed from 3 different martial disciplines and 3 different conflicts. But the man was strong, panic strength, grief strength, the kind of strength that only comes when you've already lost everything you're trying to hold onto. He pulled forward instead of backward. The blade slashed across her ribs as they went down together, her back hitting the linoleum with enough force to drive air from her lungs. Her blood pooled on white tile like someone had poured a can of red paint into a geometrical space. She could see her own arterial spray for just a moment before she shifted her weight and kept moving. Her right hand maintained pressure on her left shoulder while her left kept his knife hand pinned against the floor, using her body weight as leverage, using the edge of her forearm against his wrist bone like she'd learned in a gymnasium that was technically a supply closet at a forward operating base in Ramadi. She was breathing hard, but her voice came out steady, the voice she'd used talking down combatants, talking down soldiers who'd lost friends, talking down the parts of people that were still human underneath the trauma. Your brother's name was Michael. I remember him. He was kind to the night staff. She wasn't making it up, she'd actually seen him, actually held his chart once, actually noted that he'd thanked the nurses even through the post-operative pain that most patients just endured in silence. Michael wouldn't want this for you. He wouldn't want you becoming the person your grief wants you to be. The man was sobbing. His entire body went slack, like all the rage had burned through whatever fuel it was running on and left him hollow. The knife dropped from his fingers. Margaret kept her hands where they were anyway, holding pressure on her wounds because her training understood physics better than it understood mercy. Blood loss at this rate, maybe 5 minutes before she started losing peripheral vision, maybe 8 before she started losing consciousness. The knife clattered once more on the tile. Her blood had pooled 3 inches from his face. Police arrived at 3:52. They cuffed him gently. He wasn't resisting anymore, he was just sobbing, already broken in a way that handcuffs couldn't make worse. They stepped over Margaret's blood without acknowledging it because in a hospital, blood is just part of the infrastructure, just another fluid to be managed and removed. Paramedics arrived seconds later. Margaret finally released pressure on her wounds and let them move her hands, moving her to the trauma bay with the kind of efficiency that comes from handling stabbing victims on a regular Friday afternoon. 23 stitches. The attending physician who sutured her worked with methodical precision, the needle going in and out with the specific rhythm of someone who'd done this perhaps 400 times. During the procedure, in that strange space between local anesthetic and conscious awareness, the doctor asked her the question that would change everything: how did you know those disarming techniques? That wasn't standard first aid training. Margaret stared at the ceiling where the fluorescent panels threw their colorless light across every surface, including the small gap in her own history that had just opened up wide enough for someone to see through. I watch a lot of YouTube, she said flatly. The lie came out of her mouth like it had a trained exit route. The doctor didn't believe her, exactly, but he also didn't push, because a trauma bay operates on the principle that right now is about stitches and fluids and keeping people alive, and questions about YouTube training could wait for another moment in another institutional space where they made more sense. By 8 p.m. that evening, while Margaret was still in the trauma bay with temporary bandages and painkiller coursing through her system, Whitfield had called an emergency board meeting via conference call. He had the CEO on the phone immediately, the man who owed him golfing favors and political advantages and years of accumulated reciprocal obligation. Not about honoring Margaret for stepping between him and a blade. Not about recognizing that she'd prevented a disaster using skills that most nurses couldn't begin to comprehend. About liability. About optics. About how the situation looked when you removed heroism from the narrative and replaced it with escalation. She engaged physically, Whitfield said, his voice steady now that he was talking to institutional power instead of facing the man with the knife. Had she followed protocol and retreated, security would have handled it. Instead, she created additional risk and bloodshed. The optics are problematic. The fact that she possesses undisclosed combat training is itself a liability. We're exposed. The risk management consultant, a man from outside the hospital whose job was to think of lawsuits instead of human beings, nodded his agreement across the video call. Immediate termination. The physical injury supports a claim that she acted outside her professional scope. We document her lack of training disclosure. We recommend she be escorted from the premises by security before morning shift. What happened next changed everything. But Margaret was still in the trauma bay, her ribs wrapped in gauze that would hold her together with the same principle as surgical tape holds wounds closed, temporary, fragile, dependent on the assumption that time would do the rest. She didn't know yet that by tomorrow afternoon she would have a disciplinary letter. She didn't know yet that heroism had an expiration date, that institutional self-protection moved faster than institutional gratitude, that the same person who'd stopped a blade from entering Whitfield's body would be terminated by morning because that blade had proven she was something other than just a nurse. The rain started around 9 p.m. It hammered against the hospital windows like applause for a performance nobody wanted to watch, driving hard against the glass in that aggressive rhythm that late September rain sometimes carries in Philadelphia. Margaret lay in the recovery bay and listened to it, her shoulder throbbing in a pattern that synced with her heartbeat, her ribs feeling like someone had sewn them back together using barbed wire instead of surgical thread. By morning, her world would be measured not in years of service but in stitches and disciplinary documents and the distance between doing the right thing and facing the consequences for having proven she was capable of it. The recovery bay lights flickered overhead as Margaret lay still, her left shoulder wrapped in gauze that was already beginning to seep at the edges. 23 stitches across her ribs. 23 more in her shoulder. Before dripped something cold into her right arm, and she counted the drops the way she used to count rounds during convoy ambushes, a way to keep her mind from thinking about what came next. The throbbing in her shoulder synced with her heartbeat, a rhythm she could have predicted to the millisecond. Pain was data. Pain was information about how badly the blade had torn through muscle and tissue. By 11 p.m., the discharge paperwork was in her trembling, no. Steady. Her hands were steady. The paperwork was in her hands, and a hospital administrator with the soft face of someone who'd never made a difficult decision in their life had explained her options with the tone of a man reading from a script. Administrative leave pending investigation. Unauthorized physical engagement. Liability concerns. The words landed like bullets she'd already anticipated, the trajectory so obvious that by the time they arrived, she'd already mapped where they would hit. What they didn't know was that Dr. Whitfield had called an emergency board meeting at 9 p.m., before her stitches were even dry. The hospital CEO, a man named Martin Hayes who played golf with Whitfield every Thursday and who owed him the favor of 8 years of profitable equipment contracts, had picked up his phone at home and listened to Whitfield's version of events, how Margaret had escalated a volatile psychiatric crisis, how her unauthorized combat techniques had endangered other staff members, how her undisclosed military training represented a liability the hospital's insurance wouldn't cover. Hayes had nodded along, hadn't asked questions, had simply called the board chair and recommended immediate action. By 10:16 p.m., Whitfield was on the phone with the state nursing board, his voice steady and concerned as he detailed Margaret's emotional instability, her aggressive response patterns, her concerning psychological profile. He used words like escalation and unpredictable and potentially dangerous, and he sounded like a concerned colleague rather than a man covering his tracks. The fabricated concerns were so smoothly woven into legitimate clinical observations that they would survive initial review. The state board would flag her file. An outside risk management consultant, brought in by midnight email, would recommend immediate termination for creating unsafe working conditions. By 4 a.m., that recommendation would be official. Margaret hadn't slept. She'd sat at her kitchen table in her blood-stained scrubs, the stains rust-brown now, the fabric stiff where her blood had dried. The discharge papers were in front of her, along with the disciplinary letter on Seattle General letterhead. The words blurred if she looked at them too long, so she didn't look. She looked instead at the kitchen window where the pre-dawn darkness pressed against the glass like something alive. At 3:16 a.m., Emma appeared in the doorway wearing her dinosaur pajamas, her hair standing up on one side where she'd slept on it. The small shape froze when she saw her mother. Margaret's shoulders didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. But Emma's voice, when it came, was the voice of a child who understood that something fundamental had shifted. "Mommy? Why are you home early?" Margaret's jaw tightened once. Just once. Then she opened her arm, the one not wrapped in bandages, and Emma came to her, burying her face in Margaret's chest, and felt her mother's heart beating against her cheek like it was the only real thing left in the world. "Are we in trouble? Do we have to move again?" The question was so small, so weighted with the memory of 5 previous moves, 5 previous names, 5 previous lives that had collapsed when the wrong person found the right thread to pull. Margaret pulled her daughter closer, and she didn't answer because the answer was yes. If Whitfield dug into her background, if he contacted any federal investigative agency, if he somehow connected the dots between the billing discrepancy he'd been hiding and the woman who'd witnessed it, naval intelligence would emerge from whatever dark corner they occupied and erase her again. The men she'd saved in Ramadi didn't exist in any database. Their names weren't in any official record. She'd carried them out on her back and in her hands, and they'd been spirited away to rehabilitation facilities that weren't on any map. She didn't exist either. Existing meant danger for people who'd already sacrificed enough. At 6 a.m., Margaret drove to Seattle General in the pre-dawn silence. Her hands on the steering wheel were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She'd changed out of the bloody scrubs and into clean clothes, had wrapped her ribs with an ACE bandage to support the stitches, had pinned her hair back in the same bun she wore to every shift. She would not present as wounded. She would not present as defeated. Her badge, the one that had worked for 3 years, didn't work when she swiped it at the employee entrance. The light flashed red. The electronic lock remained closed. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, processing the message, then walked around to the main entrance where Marcus, the veteran security guard who'd worked the night shift, saw her coming and his shoulders sagged like he'd been hit. Marcus was a former Army Ranger, decorated, still strong in the way that comes from a body that remembers what it was trained to do. He'd worked at Seattle General for 2 years, ever since a shoulder injury had ended his contract. 3 years ago, Margaret had been the one to stitch his hand after he'd punched the concrete wall in the parking lot during a panic attack. She'd used field sutures, the kind you don't learn in nursing school, the kind you learn from keeping people alive in places where hospitals are abstract concepts. He'd gone very still while she worked, and when she finished, he'd looked at his hand and then at her, and he'd said quietly, "What unit?" She hadn't answered. But he'd known. And from that moment, there had been an understanding between them that transcended the hierarchy of the hospital, that lived in the space between people who'd been to the other side of the world and come back changed. Now his eyes tracked her as she approached, and he stepped forward to intercept her before anyone else could. "They're saying you're not allowed in the building, Chief," he stopped himself, corrected course. "Sorry. Margaret. The order came down at midnight. I'm not supposed to let you pass the doors." She looked at him steadily. "Can you bring me my locker contents?" He nodded, disappeared through the automatic doors like a man grateful for a clear directive. She waited in the pre-dawn cold. The parking lot was nearly empty, the graveyard shift was still working, the day shift hadn't arrived yet. She was in the liminal space between legitimate presence and trespass, and she felt the weight of it in her chest like a physical thing. Then Whitfield appeared in the lobby, flanked by 2 hospital administrators, and the moment crystallized. He was already in his clothes, already dressed for the day, pressed shirt, silk tie the color of old money, his face arranged in an expression of grave concern that looked practiced. The automatic doors slid open and he stepped through them with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his right to occupy space. Behind him came Marcus, carrying her cardboard box. Inside that box was her life at Seattle General, her scrubs, her lunch containers, the worn combat boots with Ramadi sand still embedded in the creases where canvas met sole. She'd carried Sergeant Moss for miles in those boots, barefoot for the last 2 because the heels had torn open on the rocks. The sand had come from the blast zone. She'd never washed them. "Margaret, you're trespassing," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of official procedure. "The investigation has found sufficient cause for immediate termination. Your nursing license review will proceed through proper channels." She stood perfectly still. The pre-dawn light was beginning to soften the darkness, turning the parking lot a shade of grey-blue that reminded her of the hour before dawn in Ramadi, when the call to prayer would echo across the city and you'd know you had maybe 2 hours of relative quiet. "I saved your life yesterday," she said flatly. No emotion. No accusation. A statement of fact. "You created liability," he corrected, and his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of victory. "There's a difference." "Security, please escort." Marcus handed her the box. She took it, turned, walked toward the parking lot. The cardboard was soft and beginning to collapse from the weight of her discarded identity. And that's when she saw Emma, standing near the far edge of the lot, having followed in a ride-share, watching through the glass doors as her mother was escorted out like a criminal who'd broken something sacred. 2 days passed. 2 days of Margaret sitting in her apartment with the blinds drawn, her daughter at school because she refused to disrupt Emma's routine, because that one constant was the only thing she could control. The stitches in her ribs pulled when she breathed too deeply. The stitches in her shoulder burned. She applied ice, took ibuprofen, did nothing else. The notification came that her nursing license was under review. The state board wanted a formal hearing. Whitfield's fabricated concerns were already spreading through the hospital grapevine, a source familiar with the investigation, a cautious colleague wondering aloud if maybe it had been a warning sign all along. Had anyone else noticed how intense she could be, how focused, how she sometimes seemed to operate on a frequency no one else could access? The narrative was settling into place. She would be erased not by naval intelligence this time but by the simple machinery of institutional self-protection, one allegation building on another until the weight of it became too much to challenge. At 2 p.m. on the 3rd day after the stabbing, Margaret drove to Seattle General to collect her belongings. There was no reason to wait any longer. The slower she moved, the more time bureaucracy had to build its case. She parked at the far edge of the lot, away from the main entrance, and walked across asphalt still wet from overnight rain. The air smelled like diesel exhaust and the ghost of antiseptic drifting out through the vac system. She'd made it maybe 15 feet when the sound hit, a sound that made every cell in her body stand at attention. Multiple diesel engines. Heavy vehicles. And underneath it, the synchronized rhythm of boot heels on asphalt. 2 days after the knife went through her shoulder, the parking lot at Seattle General filled with the sound of synchronized boot heels on asphalt. 75 Army soldiers in dress uniforms formed ranks in perfect formation, their dress blues sharp as blades against the gray Philadelphia morning. Margaret watched from the 3rd-floor window of her hospital room, her left arm immobilized, the stitches pulling tight across her ribs with every breath. She didn't know they were coming. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. The colonel entered the lobby at 8:41 a.m. His voice carried like thunder through the atrium, cutting through the morning chatter of staff and visitors with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard over rotors and diesel engines. "I'm looking for Chief Walsh." Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. His uniform bore the insignia of United States Army Central Command, the kind of authority that made CEO James Hartford's already pale face drain of additional color. The security desk staff froze. Margaret's name, her real name, her military name, echoed off the tile floors like a secret being shouted in a church. Dr. Whitfield was in his office when the colonel's voice reached him. He'd been reviewing his termination paperwork, the hospital's legal team having moved with stunning efficiency once the board decided his liability exceeded his value. His phone had been ringing for 20 minutes, the state medical board, his malpractice insurance carrier, 3 separate attorneys demanding retainer payments. He didn't answer. He sat instead in the leather chair he'd occupied for 14 years and stared at the wall where his diplomas hung. The colonel walked into the lobby where Margaret now stood, having moved from her window with the careful deliberation of someone whose ribs were held together by 23 stitches and sheer determination. Her daughter Emma stood beside her, 12 years old and holding her mother's uninjured hand with white-knuckle intensity. The silence stretched across the lobby like a held breath. The Colonel's eyes found Margaret's, and something in them, recognition, respect, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for those who'd walked through fire, shifted the entire temperature of the room. Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, United States Navy, retired, the Colonel announced, his voice climbing to reach every corner of the atrium. Your service record has been partially unsealed by direct order of the Department of Defense. 18 years. 3 combat deployments. 1 classified extraction operation in Ramadi that resulted in the survival of 17 personnel under active fire. He paused. The news cameras that had been permitted into the hospital, 3 local stations responding to a tip, swung their lenses toward Margaret. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Sergeant Derek Moss walked forward then, his uniform crisp, his face bearing the kind of careful neutrality that came from living with incomplete memories. He held something in his hands, a pair of combat boots, sand-scarred and worn, the leather cracked from desert heat and time. Chief Walsh carried me for miles through enemy fire in Ramadi, he said, his voice steady despite the obvious effort it took. An IED hit our convoy. Shredded my left side. Collapsed lung. Open chest trauma. He looked down at the boots in his hands. I was bleeding out. No medevac was coming. Command said stand by. I was 27 minutes from cardiac arrest. He lifted his eyes to Margaret's. This woman performed direct cardiac massage through my open chest cavity, while rounds were still coming down. She used her hands where a surgical team should have been. She used her hands and didn't stop until we reached a forward surgical team at FOB Shank. His voice cracked once, then steadied. That name on my arm? I don't remember getting it. I don't remember most of Ramadi. But I never forgot her name. It's the only thing my brain held onto. The room had gone quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed their relentless mechanical song, but underneath that sound was something heavier, the weight of 75 soldiers standing at attention in a parking lot, the weight of declassified service records, the weight of 17 lives that had continued because Margaret Walsh had chosen to act instead of follow the rules that civilians pretend matter when lives are on the line. The Colonel turned then, and his expression had shifted to something colder. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, please report to the lobby. The words weren't a request. They were a command, the kind that moved through the hospital's intercom system like a summons to reckoning. Whitfield didn't come. Security found him in his office, his hand shaking as he reached for his desk phone. Marcus, the veteran security guard who'd been ordered to escort Margaret out 3 days prior, was the one who escorted Whitfield down instead. When Whitfield reached the lobby, the Colonel was waiting. So was the evidence. Dr. Whitfield, the Colonel said, and there was no warmth in those words, no negotiation in the tone. The Department of Defense takes a particular interest when decorated service members are targeted for retaliation. He held up a tablet. The screen showed invoices, cardiac monitors that appeared on purchase orders but never arrived, surgical equipment billed at premium rates but sourced from secondary suppliers, profit margins that didn't add up unless someone was making them add up. The offshore accounts in Whitfield's name. The pattern stretching back for years. The brother of the knife wielder, a man whose own complications from substandard surgical equipment had cascaded into sepsis and death, connected to everything through paper trails and billing codes. The fraud specialist we consulted, the Colonel continued, identified a systematic pattern of equipment substitution for profit. The risk management consultant you personally hired to recommend Chief Walsh's termination? The FBI flagged him for identical fraud schemes at 4 separate hospitals. Your golfing buddy, CEO Hartford, authorized the purchase orders that made you $847,000 in personal profit. The Colonel lowered the tablet. Chief Walsh discovered these discrepancies accidentally when she signed for a cardiac monitor shipment that didn't match invoice quantities. She said nothing. She protected her patient instead of her career. The man who stabbed you, doctor? His brother died from complications involving exactly the kind of cheap equipment you substituted into patient care. Chief Walsh didn't know any of this. She simply saw a weapon and someone who needed protection. She chose to act. Whitfield's face had transformed into something raw. His mouth moved but nothing emerged. Around him, the hospital staff, residents and nurses and respiratory therapists and every technician who'd ever watched him demean Margaret had stopped moving entirely. The silence pressed down like a physical force. CEO James Hartford appeared through the administrative corridor, his expression cycling rapidly through calculations as he processed the implications. The SEC violations. The fraud charges. The federal investigation. The press cameras capturing every second. His golfing arrangement with Whitfield suddenly weighed nothing against the Department of Defense standing in his lobby with declassified records and television cameras rolling. Dr. Whitfield, you are terminated effective immediately for obstruction of a decorated service member, fraud, and endangerment of patient care, Hartford said, and the words came out flat, stripped of any authority because his authority had evaporated. Security will escort you from the premises. The irony wasn't subtle. Whitfield had threatened Margaret with that same escort. Now he was receiving it from Marcus, who took particular satisfaction in positioning himself at the doctor's left side with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed a smile. Whitfield tried to speak. This is illegal termination. I have a contract. I'll sue. I have documentation. The colonel handed Hartford a folder without looking at Whitfield. The FBI arrives within the hour, the colonel said. I suggest cooperation rather than litigation. Whitfield was walked toward the exit, toward the glass doors that faced the parking lot where 75 soldiers stood in perfect formation, their presence a reminder that some things mattered more than institutional hierarchy or profit margins or the carefully constructed authority of men in expensive shoes. As Whitfield passed through the doors, Marcus's hand never touching him, just a presence at his back that made clear where he belonged, a resident started clapping. One person. Then another. The slow clap spread through the lobby like a wave, until nearly every person in the atrium was standing and applauding, and Margaret stood motionless in the center of it, her daughter's hand still in hers, her ribs screaming with every breath, her face absolutely still. Sergeant Moss walked to her then. He held out the combat boots, the ones she'd left behind in Ramadi, the ones that somehow had made their way through 13 years and multiple continents and classified military channels until someone realized they belonged to the woman who'd saved 17 lives. These are yours, Chief, he said. Margaret took them with steady hands. The sand still trapped in the boot treads caught the morning light like tiny diamonds. Her daughter squeezed her hand tighter, and for the first time in 3 days, Margaret allowed herself to breathe without pretense. 6 months later, Margaret's office at Seattle General overlooked the parking lot where 75 soldiers had stood at attention. The nameplate on her door read, Margaret Walsh, Master Chief Petty Officer, Retired, Director, Trauma Training Program. The office had windows overlooking the city, with a bookshelf that held her unsealed service records and a photograph from that parking lot day, soldiers in perfect formation, Emma's small hand visible in Margaret's, and sand-scarred combat boots sitting on the desk between them. The boots now rested on the shelf behind her, a permanent reminder of the 4 miles she'd carried a man who couldn't remember his own name but remembered hers tattooed on his forearm. Dr. Whitfield's fraud trial had lasted 3 weeks. 17 counts of healthcare fraud. 5 counts of obstruction. 2 counts of conspiracy. His medical license had been revoked by the state board in a decision that took less time than it had taken him to destroy Margaret's career. The last anyone at Seattle General heard, he was teaching CPR basics at Philadelphia Community College for minimum wage, his designer watches sold to cover legal fees, his consulting contracts terminated, his professional network reduced to 0 because people didn't call back the man with a federal conviction and a Department of Defense stamp on his folder. Margaret's new trauma training program combined civilian emergency medicine with combat casualty care, the kind of techniques that saved lives in emergency rooms and battlefields with equal precision. The The surgical residents who trained under her treated her with the reverence reserved for living legends. She taught them to perform emergency cricothyrotomies when standard intubation failed. She taught them to pack wounds with hemostatic gauze and understand ticking clocks. She taught them that the quietest person in the room might be the most dangerous, and that assumptions killed patients faster than any disease. Emma understood now. The moves. The careful composure. The way her mother could hold crisis in her hands without flinching. The school essay she'd written about her mother had won a state award. Margaret had framed it and hung it beside the photograph of the soldiers. True class is what you do when the lights go out, Margaret would tell the residents during teaching rounds, and they would nod and write it down because they understood they were being taught by someone who'd already defined what that meant in blood and sand and 18 years of service that nobody asked about anymore. The applause when she finished her final remarks lasted 45 seconds. If you've been with us before, welcome back, hit that like button. If you're new, we're glad you're here, please subscribe. Either way, leave a comment and say hello.